It is nice to see you all. I appreciate it. And I remember when we spoke in this building in the big room upstairs about 4 years ago now. And we actually had some school officials at the time that came. And they were kind of shaking their head no to everything we said. They didn't stay when it was over to tell us what was wrong. It's funny, I've given 600 of these talks now in 46 states. And all of our information, as you're going to see, it's documented. You can find it yourself. We'll send you, if you just simply email us, we'll put up at the end an email address. You can email me. We will send you these slides for free. So verify, you should check us. Double check what we're telling you. Look at the sources of everything we put down and follow the links. You'll find out, again, 600 of these talks in 46 states. We've testified before 25 different state legislatures. No one has ever yet come back to us and proven that anything we say in this talk is not true. Not one time. So if you can do that, great. If there are mistakes, I'd love to see them, but no one's shown them to us yet. So 4 or 5 years ago, we gave a talk here, and there were some school folk. They disagreed with everything. They didn't stick around for questions. And here we are 6 years into this, and every single thing we said was going to happen has happened. Every single thing. And so we're going to go back and revisit some of that. We're going to talk about what the future holds. We're going to talk about how Common Core is not even an issue anymore. That's the real story here. Don't even bother fighting Common Core. It has become such a part of the curriculum now. States all across the country, rather than get rid of Common Core, they rebranded it. In compliance with the federal government, states like Florida, Indiana, Oklahoma, South Carolina, states that claim they got rid of Common Core did no such thing. They simply rebranded them. Mike Pence, Republican governor, who's now our vice president, he was one of the first governors in the country to be overwhelmed by the complaints of the citizens. Indiana people revolted very early against Common Core. So what did Mr. Pence do? He declared Common Core dead in Indiana, but then he turned those same standards right back over to the State Department of Education in Indiana. And lo and behold, they kept 98% of Common Core, and they simply branded them Indiana State Standards. In Florida, Republican Governor Chris, he did the same thing. Floridians didn't want the standards, so what did they do? He declared them dead in the state of Florida. They handed them back over to the Florida Board of Education. And you're seeing the pattern here, right? Even when you've got very Republican governors, you've got very, very progressive people at the state level running things. Look at your state, look at Wisconsin, right? It doesn't really matter what the legislature says. Tony Evers has got his own little fiefdom, right? So the Republicans can control the governorship, the Senate, the Assembly, the Supreme Court, all sorts of things, but they don't control anything in education, right? And so you have a bit of a problem here. And that's what's happened over and over again across the country. So the Common Core issue is kind of a dead issue. What Common Core started to be has now filtered throughout the entire curriculum. It's not just an English and math program anymore. Common Core methodology, Common Core worldview, Common Core pedagogy, it now informs everything we do at the high school, middle school, elementary, and even the preschool level, and I'll show you that too. So you can't get rid of it. And again, with all due respect, thanks to Republicans, in 2015, December of 2015, 4 days before Christmas on a Friday, the Republican majorities in the Senate and the House in Washington passed the ESSA Act. We'll see that here as well, the Every Student Succeed Act. Paul Ryan from our state gave the Republicans, his caucus, 2 days to read an 1,100-page bill before they had to vote on it. When everybody was worrying about Christmas shopping, Republicans who controlled the House and the Senate in 2015, they passed legislation, the ESSA Act, which enshrines in stone Common Core. What that bill does, the ESSA Act, is it goes back and all of the illegal things that the Obama administration did to elevate education control to the feds, the Republicans indemnified him for. And I'll show you the proof of that before we're done. I'd like to leave that too as maybe my final introduction. This is a completely apolitical talk in the sense that there are no heroes. The Republicans are as bad as the Democrats. Republicans control the vast majority of state governorships, the vast majority of state assemblies, and not a single state has gotten rid of this. And it's because the feds have spent a lot of money to keep it. And those Republican governors who are seeking to make budget cuts elsewhere are reaping that windfall from the feds to pay for other cuts. So when it comes to Washington, D.C., you don't have an answer. And I'll go one step further. Donald Trump promised to get rid of the Department of Education. Donald Trump promised to get rid of the federal Common Core standards. He's not doing either one of those things. He appointed a woman, Secretary DeVos, to the Department of Education, who used her considerable fortune in Michigan to keep Common Core in Michigan after Michiganders desperately wanted it gone. Now, Betsy DeVos is infinitely better than anybody anybody Hillary Clinton would have appointed. There's no doubt about that. But you're not getting rid of the Department of Education. And you are not getting rid of the ESSA Act under Betsy DeVos, which means you are not getting rid of Common Core. You are not getting rid of, you don't like all this federal control. We're not getting rid of all the sex in your kids' schools. We're not getting rid of all the tendentious global warming propaganda for little kids who can't understand it. We're not getting rid of any of that stuff. Transgenderism in your elementary and middle schools, not getting rid of that either. Donald Trump had the occasion, one of the first things he said he was going to do when he became president was rescind the dear colleague letter, dear friend letter that he wrote, basically threatening, not a law, by the way, just advice from the government. Either you create transgender bathrooms, either you start teaching about transgenderism to little kids, or you're going to suffer the consequences at the State House, the Department of Justice. He did none of those things. In fact, we know now that it was his daughter and son-in-law, Ivanka and her husband, Jared Kushner, who talked him out of rescinding that dear friend law. So the reality is, and without being too hard on Donald Trump, I mean, really, what does Donald Trump know about public schools? He was raised by a very wealthy family, all of whom went to private schools. He went to the best private schools. His kids go to the best private schools. None of his kids. This is the thing. People who've done this to you, their kids will never, ever labor in the public schools. The Bush kids, the Obama kids, they'll never send their kids to schools that have things like Common Core in them. They're going to send their kids to the really expensive private schools that teach a classical education. They always do. But they deny it to your kids. And so, as we begin, understand that this is not a Democrat or a Republican problem. I like to call Common Core, and forget Common Core, stop using it, the takeover of education by the federal government. There's a reason your founding fathers made absolutely no provision for public schools, because they knew, running away from what they ran away from to start this country, they knew if the government, the state, was primarily in charge of educating your kids, they would eventually come to educate their kids, your kids, for their purposes, not yours. For the purposes of the big federal institutions, not for your local communities. They were going to make education beneficial to bureaucrats and politicians, not to teachers and students, and that's what they've done. And again, this is a Beltway versus the rest of us problem. It's not a Democrat problem or Republican problem. It is a Washington, D.C., people who think the feds should be in control of everything, from healthcare to education, versus the rest of us who recognize, and I'll challenge you, I'll give me one example of anything major that the Fed has taken away from the states that they've done a better job with. Things like the military always were their province. Name something that the feds have hijacked that runs better now, because they run nothing. There's nothing. And we know it's not good. We know it can't possibly be the same with education. Here's the other dirty little secret. 8 years ago, this whole thing got rolling. 6 years ago, the standards were implemented. And we have 6 years of failure. Our kids are performing worse and worse on the tests they wrote to support their standards. It is a failure. And it's failing for all the reasons we said it was going to fail. One-size-fits-all education doesn't work. Again, raise your hand if you consider your kids to be common. No? Raise your hand if you consider your kids standard. See, you don't, do you? But they do. I like what Albert Einstein said in the 1930s when the Nazi regime was doing a lot of this. It was federalizing their schools. It was providing national socialized medicine to the families. It was taking kids away from their parents and educating them collectively. They were treating kids not as individuals but as part of a collective. That's exactly what's happening now. And back when that was happening in Nazi Germany, they were standardizing the tests. They were using standardization as a way to turn kids into the same kid across the board. We're doing it in the name of social justice. The Nazis did it in the name of national unity. And you know what? There's not a lick of difference between those two things. Social justice is neither, the way the progressives use it, is neither social nor just. It is unjust, and it is antisocial. Einstein said of that movement in Germany to federalize the schools, to nationalize them, he said, you standardize automobiles. You never standardize children. What we want here, and what Common Core was part of a long step. Remember, Common Core didn't emanate out of nothing. Go back to 1979, when we created a huge federal entity to look over education. Education was working just fine in the country, much better than it is now in 1979. You knew what was going to happen when they created a huge federal Department of Education. That Department of Education has no ability to educate your kids. In fact, do you know less than 10% of the employees at the Department of Education have any educational credentials whatsoever? 90% of the over 5,000 employees at the Department of Education have nothing to do with education, no experience, no training, no expertise. They are not running government schools now to benefit you or to make your kids smarter. It's using the control of money. All the money now that used to go to the states directly funnels through the Department of Education. And the education decides who they're going to reward and who they're going to punish, who they're going to bribe and who they're going to blackmail with that money. And now, under Betsy DeVos, she didn't do this, but this is the way the system worked because of the ESSA Act. You do have the right, Wisconsin, to create your own educational pedagogy, your own educational standards for the state of Wisconsin. But you must run them through the Department of Education, and they have to approve them. And if they don't, you don't get any money. In other words, they control it now. They'll tell you, yeah, it's absolutely true, Wisconsin. You can write your own standards, but if they don't like them, tough. You don't get any money. And that's the problem now. That's the situation we're in now. They control it. And we said way back 4 years ago here, we said the exact same thing. You had a very narrow window to get rid of Common Core. 4 years ago, you could have affected change at the state level. 4 years ago, if Governor Walker got behind this, 4 years ago, if the Republicans who controlled the Senate and the Assembly had made a push to challenge Tony Evers, you could have made some progress. It was not done. And the consequence of that is, there's no real way to fix this at the state level, because you got to change it at the federal level. And you understand how much harder that is, right? And many of our state legislators, both Republicans and Democrats, are happy because it's not their responsibility anymore. Wisconsin school kids' education really isn't their problem anymore. And you understand whose it is. I made this exact statement 4 years ago. Pretty soon, if we don't act to stop Common Core as a state, then what's going to happen is, if you want to change anything, you're going to have to call 1-800 Department of Education. And I said to you then, how much Muzak do you think you're going to have to listen to before somebody in Washington picks up your phone call? And that's our problem. We have much more control over state politics than we do over federal politics. And now, education is primarily a Fed problem. And that's where we sit. That's why the Common Core issue is dead. But before Common Core, you had George W. Bush, right? We think of Common Core, we think of Barack Obama, evil, 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 and yes it was, but was it much better than No Child Left Behind? No. In fact, who wrote No Child Left Behind, remember? Kennedy. You got it, right? People think No Child Left Behind, they think George W. Bush. George W. Bush, this uber right-winger, allowed the most liberal member of the Senate, arguably the most liberal member of the Senate ever, to write the entire education package that we now know as No Child Left Behind. And what was it? It was one-size-fits-all education. It was outcome-based education. That's what Common Core is. Outcome-based. We don't worry about your kid's individual talents. We don't worry about, in the classroom anymore, where the child in front of you is educationally. We worry about where we have to get them to. And it has to be the same place for every kid. That's mandated now. You're going to get 60 million American school kids to exactly the same place. By definition, it has to be a lower place, right? Because the minute you raise standards, what happens? Social injustice. These kids can't make it, so you lower the standards. That's why it's failing. But it's even failing by its own standard, right? We've lowered the standards overall, and our kids still can't reach them. Why? Because you're not teaching them primarily education material now. The primary purpose of Americans' classrooms is no longer reading, writing, and arithmetic. And I'll prove this to you in about 2 seconds. The primary purpose under Common Core, and before Common Core you had No Child Left Behind, before No Child Left Behind you had Goals 2000 with the Clinton administration, and before that, all the way back through the 80s, this has been going on for a long time. I phrase it like this: in the early 1960s, control of the classroom was entirely in the hands of the teachers. In 1960, teachers gave the exams, they taught the subject matter, they evaluated the kids, and they gave grades. That made sense. The teachers saw them every day. The teachers knew who the 30 kids they had in their classroom were. In the 70s, all that control was pushed up from the classroom to the districts. In the 80s and late 90s, that was pushed from the districts up to the state level. And ever since about the mid-1990s, more and more we have pushed control of the classroom up to the federal level. It has now been accomplished. The feds are the primary stakeholders now. Not you, not your kids. You pay the real estate property taxes. You fund these schools. But you have almost no say in what goes on in your local schools. Almost none. Our school boards, our elected school boards, we got a representative right here, they've become nothing more than rubber stamps for what superintendents tell you the state says you have to do, right? And even when you get a good one like Chris on there, he's constantly fighting against superintendents who march into these school board meetings, and this is how the state says it has to be done. This is what the feds want. And you have very limited ability to fight that. We also predicted 3 and 4 years ago that local school boards were going to become relatively ineffectual because there's not a whole lot they can do. And even if you do get critical mass on the school board. You're still fighting uphill with this. See what happened to Germantown, Wisconsin, right? Germantown is the one school district that adamantly rejected Common Core state standards, as is their right. And to this day, 4 years later, the state is still trying to punish them, still withholding money from them, still threatening them with lawsuits, still trying to force them to become part of the big state curriculum. We run a private school. Freedom Project Academy is a completely online, government-free school to try to help moms homeschool if they want to get out of the system. We keep hearing about how broke the state of Wisconsin schools are. Every month, once a month, sometimes twice a month, we get direct letters from the DPI in Wisconsin, the broke DPI, offering us as a private school money. They've got thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars they want to give us. Why? Because if we take their money, then we have to play by their rules. They don't have money to educate your kids, they say, but they got plenty of money to try to shop around to people like us. It just tells you what kind of a scam we're dealing with. To understand this, we have to just remember this guy. And, he was just indicted. Did you see that? This is Jonathan Gruber. He is one of the architects of the Obamacare legislation. I always like to start my talk with this, because he told the truth. In 2014, after Obamacare was securely in place, and now you see, right? By all means, keep giving power to the Republicans and they're not getting rid of it. It's not going anywhere. He told, once it's in, it can't come out. I can't think of a single major federal takeover of anything that was ever reversed in the history of this country. And so after Obamacare had become law, and you remember nobody read that either, 26,000 pages, nobody read it. And here's what John Gruber very honestly said about how government does business these days. Got it?
Law which said healthy people are going to pay in, it made explicit that healthy people pay in and sick people get money, it would not have passed. Okay, just like to have people lack of transparency is a huge political advantage. And basically, call it the stupidity of the American voter or whatever. But basically, that was really, really critical to getting the thing to pass.
If we had told you what was in the bill, you wouldn't have passed it. You wouldn't have wanted it. Call it your own stupidity. Call the voters stupid. But lack of transparency, us not telling you what's going on, is how we win these things. And interestingly, he was just indicted a couple months ago for embezzlement, basically, for overcharging the feds. $6 million his consulting fees cost, right? So now he's finding himself up against it. But I always show you that clip to make one point to you. Say what you will about national health care. That was a model of transparent government compared to how they fixed your schools. Everybody was talking about Obamacare. Obamacare had hearings in the Senate and the Congress. Obamacare was on C-SPAN. Obamacare had hearings before the Supreme Court. None of that happened with Common Core. When they ultimately transformed your schools, I shouldn't say ultimately, when they took that next big leap forward in transforming your schools, they didn't consult any of you. They did not consult the moms and dads. It was in your schools before you ever heard about it. Your teachers went home one June morning for summer school, and then they came back in August, late August, and the textbooks had been transformed. All the old textbooks were pulled away. All the new textbooks were in place. All the old ways of teaching were now no longer prohibited. And these teachers were taught on the job how to minister to the Common Core. No prior training whatsoever. The whole system was completely, this was in 2012. We didn't start fighting Common Core until it's a whole year before anybody knew enough about it to figure out what had happened. And all this money had been spent on it, all these new textbooks had been purchased. When we went to schools, right, and tried to showed them why this won't work and why it's dangerous, their response was, well, we bought all these new textbooks, we have no more money. You give us $100,000, we'll buy new textbooks. And nobody had that money, right? The whole thing was set up that way. So education, which I would argue is even more important than healthcare. There are alternative ways we can look after each other. There are alternative ways we can try to take care of our healthcare needs. But when you start educating generation after generation of young minds to believe anti-American propaganda, to believe in socialism, to believe that the founding of this country is a racist mistake, and you look what's going on in schools with the Antifa, what's going on in the NFL, for God's sake, right? This kind of absolute clueless, mindless stuff. That's the consequence of what goes on in your schools now. And it's been happening at the university since the 1960s, and I've said this to you before. What you want one sentence about, you want to understand Common Core or Goals 2000 or No Child Left Behind, here's how you understand it. One sentence. Think about what's wrong with your universities. Think about the one-sided, politically, ideologically biased way universities go about their jobs. And pull that now. It dawned on them, the progressives, that it works. How many of our kids with good Christian upbringings or good patriotic values go to college, 4 years later they come home and tell you why you're a fascist, right? They recognized how well it worked at the university level. So Common Core is simply, all of this federal intervention is to pull that ideological way of teaching down to the high schools, down into the middle schools, and down even into the elementary schools. And to understand this, I mean, this sounds shocking, but it won't sound shocking if we just spend about 10 minutes trying to understand the history of public schools in this country. Your founding fathers did make no provision for public schools, and we're going to start calling them government schools because the government, the feds own it now, government schools. The founding fathers made no provision, not because they were terribly educated men. They were men dedicated. People like Jefferson were dedicated to education. But they understood that it was primarily a family issue, that families were the ones. And think about the one-room schoolhouse model, right? Where a local community like yours here, right? What you would 200 years ago, what you would have done 150 years ago, what would you have done? This local town, right, of 7,000 people would have gotten together and hired your own teachers. Communities within your little town would have hired your own teachers to have them teach in a building. You paid their salary. You provided food for these teachers. They lived in the back of the schoolhouse. And you sent all your kids to that, in that neighborhood, you sent your kids to that school. And guess what? If the teacher couldn't teach the kids or they weren't learning anything, you could fire them on the spot and bring in other teachers. You had absolute control over this. About 1850, the American public school model was born, and Horace Mann, there are statues to Horace Mann in every state in the Union. There are statues to Horace Mann praising him as the father of American public schools. When Horace Mann put the American public school system together, do you know what model he used? He did not. He looked around the world to find a model that he could base the American school system on. He chose the authoritarian Prussian system. Prussia was a region of northwestern Germany, very militaristic, Otto von Bismarck. Philosophically, they were the precursors of Nazism in many respects. That's the model Mann picked. Why? Because he wanted schools to be about controlling kids, not educating them. He wanted schools to become tools of the state, not opportunities for kids to blossom as independent thinkers. He chose that on purpose. In fact, here's what he said about them. In 1850, when the schools got rolling, after a child has arrived at the legal age for attending school, whether child of noble or of peasant, the only two absolute grounds of exemption from attendance are sickness and death. We who are engaged in the sacred cause of education are entitled to look upon all parents as having given hostages to our cause. From the very beginning, Horace Mann did not believe that parents should be allowed to educate their children. Horace Mann did not believe that parents had the right to pass on their values, their religion, their ethos to their own children. This is quite literally, in his own words, this is a hostage situation. We want to divorce your parents from kids. We want to be the primary molding interest in kids' lives. John Dewey, and I thought when we sent you these slides, there are many, 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 many more Horace Mann slides that back this up, and many more John Dewey slides. John Dewey, perhaps more important than Horace Mann in the long run, but less credit he gets. John Dewey was not a pretend communist. He was an actual card-carrying member of the Communist Party who went to Soviet Russia in 1917 to congratulate Lenin on the takeover. And what Dewey argued for about 40 years is that the primary place to teach communist philosophy is in the elementary school classroom. One of Dewey's favorite quotes, "Children who know how to think for themselves spoil the harmony of the collective society which is coming, where everyone will be interdependent." In other words, we don't want independent thinkers. We don't want critical thinkers. We don't want kids to be educated to the strengths. We want them to be educated in a communal way. Do you understand that 150 years ago, these are the seeds of what we now call social justice education? Much less important are things like reading, writing, math, because not all kids are good. Not all kids can do math. Not all kids can read at a high level. In fact, most kids can't do everything well. Kids have different strengths and weaknesses. So what are we going to do? We're going to, in the name of social justice, commonality, right? We're going to destroy critical thinking. We are going to make sure kids come out equal. And as I said before, the only way you do that is not to pitch math high, so the real talented math kids can get it and leave the rest behind. The way you do this is to pitch it all low and replace real learning in the classroom with a whole lot of sociological manipulative garbage. And that's why, if you've read any newspapers, they're introducing transgenderism to 6-year-olds. It's why teachers in California, kindergarten teachers, are having coming out parties for transgender children at age 5. Look, whatever your view of transgenderism, homosexuality, I don't care. I'm not going to try to change your mind on it. It's not my interest. My simple point to you is, you don't teach 5-year-olds about heterosexual marriage. You don't teach 6-year-olds about heterosexual biological sex. You don't do that. Because you know it's inappropriate. Little kids can't process that. When you're teaching subjects and issues like that to young children, you're indoctrinating minds that have not learned how to think abstractly, have not developed yet. It's kind of child abuse. It's also a very effective way to make sure that those children grow up with all of your preconceived notions. See, and you wouldn't do it. Heterosexual or not, you wouldn't teach 5- and 6-year-olds that kind of sexuality, but they're doing it. Why? To break this down, right? And so we don't want children, and that's one of the primary concerns about Common Core. It does not breed critical thinking, it breeds collectivist thinking. You have these collective math assignments, right? Where kids are put in groups doing math homework together, and it doesn't matter if each kid in the group knows what the right answer is. All that matters is the collectivity of it all. And this is John Dewey at the turn of the century. Those children who know how to think for themselves spoil the harmony of the coming collective. How about, by 1983, Dewey's direct disciple, John Dunphy, who became president of the Humanist Society and had a huge role in deciding curricula and textbooks for American public schools. He wrote this in 1983. I am convinced that the battle for humankind's future must be waged and won in the public school classroom by teachers who correctly perceive their role as proselytizers of a new faith. The classroom must and will become an arena of conflict between the old and the new, the rotting corpse of Christianity, together with all its adjacent evils and misery, and the new faith of humanism, resplendent with the promise of a world in which the never-realized Christian ideal of love thy neighbor is finally achieved. Do you hear anything in his description of the schools that has anything at all to do with reading, writing, and arithmetic? There's nothing in these people's statements that has, and do you understand now why our kids' performance keeps going down? It's not the emphasis. I've said many times, when we were going to school, and I was going to school in the 70s and the 80s, I got politicized. I got a pretty decent education. I was taught how to read, write, do math, that kind of stuff. But I could feel myself being, when I was 7 years old, in 2nd grade, the 1970s, I remember having nightmares for 2 weeks because my 2nd grade teacher spent 3 weeks talking to us about the coming ice age. 1976, how the world was going to freeze to death. And which is fine. You believe that, believe it, but you don't teach that to 6-year-olds. I remember having nightmares of 6-mile-high glaciers pushing me and my entire family into the ocean sometime before morning. Because and we're doing the same thing now. We're showing that ridiculous propaganda film, An Inconvenient Truth, to 7-year-olds in public schools about dying polar bears. Even if it's true, which it's not. The fact remains that little kids can't process that. You're scaring them to death. For what reason? For no reason, no good reason. This business here is powerful, right? And as a matter of fact, you know who one of his prime disciples was, John Dunphy? Bill Ayers. And you remember Bill Ayers, the unrepentant terrorist bomber of the Pentagon in the 1960s. What was the one career open to him? He became a professor of elementary education at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Bill Ayers spent 30 years teaching thousands and thousands of young teachers. His motto, and you know what his maxim was? The place for communism, that's his word, not mine. The place for communism in America today is the elementary school. That was his entire pedagogy. How to use elementary students to begin to incorporate communist ideology. That was Bill Ayers. And so you begin to see, and what all these threads have in common, that not one of them mentioned the purpose of schooling. Not one of them. How about this? How about the NEA? How about the National Education Association? How about the largest teachers union in the country, and the union, the most political union we have? You think the Teamsters are political? These guys. They spend more of their teachers' dues on left-wing political advertising than any union in the country. As early as 1947, when American GIs came home after making the world theoretically safe for democracy, this is what their kids were beginning to learn in these public schools. In 1947, the NEA said, far too many people in America, both in and out of education, look upon the elementary school as a place to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. 1947, this is before Doris Day and Ike. right? This is before the conservative golden age of American politics. In 1947, the NEA is saying, basically, too many of you think that the primary purpose of education is, to educate kids. How about 1948? What is the purpose? Education for international understanding. That's what it is. Education for international understanding involves the use of education as a force for conditioning the will of the people. That's what it's for. Education is a tool to make citizens pliant and dependent. And we do that in the name of globalism. 1948. And we know what happened between 1948 and 1969 to America's colleges, right? What happened to the universities by 1969? They had all been completely radicalized. So much so that you right now have a kid at the University of Wisconsin who has used state of Wisconsin resources to advertise his new clothing line, which calls for the murder of police officers. And the University of Wisconsin's response to that is nothing. He has free speech. What do you think would happen if some University of Wisconsin student just flipped that script around? Do you think the University of Wisconsin would be so tolerant if it was exactly the opposite? No, of course they wouldn't be. We have all sorts of evidence of the University of Wisconsin. I teach at the University of Wisconsin, shutting up people who disagrees with their progressive politics. And so, by 1969, here's what the NEA says. This is a big one. Schools will become clinics whose purpose is to provide individualized psychosocial treatment for the student. And teachers must become psychosocial therapists. Let that sink in for a minute. We're going to make the primary we're going to put teachers with four-year education degrees. With all due respect to our teachers, they have no qualifications to evaluate. It's called psychological, social, and emotional learning. Social and emotional learning. It's in your schools here. It's in this district right here. This idea that part of what teachers must do, the main part of what they must do in the classroom, is to sociologically evaluate, to pay attention to your kids' attitudes, their behavior, their opinions, what kind of ideas and attitudes they're bringing home with them from the parents, that kind of stuff. Stuff that has none of their business, and they have no qualifications to assess. Psychosocial learning, social emotional learning it's called, SEL, has become huge, and the conduit to get it into our schools was Common Core, which has now crumbled. It's there. The idea is, the purpose of schools, 1969, is to provide individualized psychosocial treatment for students. And teachers must become psychosocial therapists. We're at that point now. And you think about it. With things like Common Core, where you have these national standards, where you have a situation where teachers aren't really free to deviate. You all had kids or grandkids. You know what it's like. When you're around little kids, your job is to teach them. From the moment your children are born, you're teaching them things. Don't put your elbows on the table. This is how you throw a curveball. Here's how you toe dance, right? You're teaching kids from the moment they're born. You understand with your own kids and grandkids that you can't teach them all the same way. Your daughter doesn't learn the same way your son does. You got 3 boys and they all have radically different interests and capacities. That's just the way it works. That's an important thing. The differences in kids. When education worked in this country, it worked because we treated kids as individuals. Kids who could jump ahead in grades, you'd let them jump ahead. We're getting rid of all these advanced programs now. We're doing away, because it's unjust. Just because your kid's better at mind and math, why does he get to move ahead? The default position now, we're chaining kids to their age group. It's not right. It's not just socially to allow smart kids to move, because there's always a hitch, right? Smart kids just have better genetics, or maybe their parents can afford tutors, and not all kids can, right? Or maybe they live in a school district that gets more money than other kids. We can't, see, we've been trying to raise the bottom performers for 100 years. We haven't been able to do it. We've made no progress. In the same way, we haven't eradicated poverty either. We've transferred $20 trillion of wealth from the haves to the have-nots since 1960. What have we accomplished? Have we eliminated poverty? Have we won the war on poverty? No. You have just, in fact, statistically, if you could believe the statistics, you have more poverty now than you did in the 1960s. How do you fix these problems, right? We've tried educationally to pull up the struggling kids. And it's dawned on us, part of this new progressive way of seeing education. Why pull up the struggling kids when you can pull down the achieving kids? Why pull up the disenfranchised kids when you can pull back the enfranchised kids? That's our model of it, and we consider that social justice, right? But as early as 1969, right, teachers will become psychosocial therapists. And now, let's jump to the Obama administration. Let's jump to what happened under Obama. Because everything I just showed you All those quotes, you'll see modern educrats saying them again. That's Ari Duncan. He is Barack Obama's Secretary of Education for almost 7 years of the 8-year term that Obama was in. Notice the date, March 2009. Obama was inaugurated in mid-January. Within 2 months of Obama's inauguration, they had hit the ground running educationally. And here's what Ari Duncan said was going to have to happen in the schools.
I think our schools should be open 12, 13, 14 hours a day. So it's not just lengthening.
So 8 to 8 or something like that?
At home, we attached healthcare clinics to about 24 of our schools. Where schools truly become the centers of the community, great things happen. And this is a chance to really create what I think the 21st century school has to look like. This needs to be the norm, not the exception. Time matters tremendously, and all of our families need our doors open longer.
Is this a big ticket item in terms of financial resources?
Finances is a piece of this, and we again have significant financial resources, unprecedented financial resources coming to the table. But let me be clear, this is thinking differently and being creative.
We need our schools open 12, 13, 14 hours a day, 365 days a year. We are beginning to build healthcare clinics on all of our new school construction. We want schools to become the centers of the community, not churches, not the family home, not the local administration, the mayor's office. We want government schools. This is what the future has to look like. The government school is the center of every community. Did you hear his faux pas? At one point, he actually called the schools, our parents want our stores open longer, he said. The idea that your kids are going to get their health care, they're going to get their moral education, they're going to get their dentistry, they're going to get their everything they're going to get from the schools. And they're going to control it, right? We want, schools open all the time. Watch what happens here, it's interesting. Here is 2015, a couple months before Duncan walked away from the Department of Education. And what happened between 2009 and 2015? The entire Common Core idea was conceived, implemented, and cemented in stone. That's what happened. And on his way out, he was thinking about the future. And before I move forward, that clinic thing is serious. We're building clinics on our new, remember what 1969 the NEA said? Schools are going to have to become clinics, right? Clinics that look after your kids, because you can't trust mom and dad to do it. In places all across the country, we're feeding kids 3 meals a day. In places like Green Bay and Memphis, Tennessee, they've won huge federal grants to feed kids breakfast, lunch, and dinner all summer long when school's out, because that's the argument, isn't it? If the government's going to feed your kid for 9 months, if we turn them over to you all summer, they'll starve to death because you don't know how to feed your kids. And get this, it's worse than that. Because of social justice education, it is now not proper to feed only the kids who need it. If you're only feeding the kids who need it, the low-income kids, you're stigmatizing them. By feeding only kids who are, for lack of a better word, poor, you're making them feel bad. So these grants mandate that every kid who goes to the school has to get government food, so the kids who need it don't feel bad. So we're actually in places like Memphis feeding kids whose parents make $1 million a year, so that the kids the poorer kids don't feel bad about it. This is what I'm telling you social justice education is. What are they putting with? And the question you got to ask yourself is, how much of what we as parents do we want to let the federal government do? Obviously, the answer is everything. 7 years into Common Core, 90% of Americans couldn't tell you anything about it. 80% of Americans have never heard the word. In a recent Gallup survey, when they asked moms and dads what they wanted most out of their public schools, education was not in the top 5 things. Better education, but what it was more services, right? Which is fine. If that's what America wants, that's what America's going to get. If you want to farm parenting out to the feds, you're going to get it. But you can't then turn around and complain when your kids grow up utterly alien to whatever you think and believe, to your worldview, to your ethos. When your parents come to see you as the problem. Because that's what's happening across the board here. And by the time he was on his way out, remember, why did I mention all this Prussian stuff 150 years ago? Well, listen to this. On his way out, here was his idea.
The one idea I threw out that I wanted to sort of road test it with the kids too, I thought, is the idea of public boarding schools. And that's a little bit of a different idea or a controversial idea. But the question is, do we have some children where there's not a mom, there's not a dad, there's not a grandma, there's just nobody home? And there are certain kids we should have 24/7.
Let that one sink in for a moment. First of all, do we have an epidemic in this country? Do we? Of 6 and 7 and 8-year-olds living absolutely alone in brownstones? We don't. I'm not suggesting that there aren't problems, but we don't have that problem. But let's pretend for the sake of argument that we do. Do you not have county agencies to handle this? Do you not have religious agencies to handle this? Do you not have city agencies? How about state agencies? You have all sorts of ways to handle that. What he's proposing here is Orwellian. Maybe we should create a system of public boarding schools across the country where we decide which kids need to be taken away from their parents. And let me ask you, given what you understand about big government over the last 50 years, do you think they're going to limit it if they get this network of public boarding schools where they can seize any kid and educate them for their own good? Do you think they're going to limit it to kids who live alone? What happens if your kid comes to school one day and his view of marriage is that marriage is between a man and a woman? How long before those public, you're abusing that child? What if your kid comes to school with values and attitudes? Because what they're teaching primarily in the schools now is social emotional learning. Teaching your kids bullying. Bullying is any worldview, ladies and gentlemen, that disagrees with their worldview. So if you teach your kids biblical values, you teach your kids biblical attitudes about male and female, you're bullying them. And this goes back to what Horace Mann said, right? He picked Prussia because they just took all the kids. Once they were born, they took them away from the parents. And they boarded them. And they fed them, and they housed them, and they clothed them, and they educated them. Okay? And that was the end of it with the parents. And even he has to acknowledge it's a controversial idea. But I promise you, if we had gotten Hillary Clinton as president, we'd be a lot closer to that now. This is where the progressive movement is taking it. Do you understand me? They don't trust you to educate your kids and grandkids. They see your influence on your children as pernicious. Something that the way you feed them, the way you let them play, the attitudes, the fact that you take them to church, this is a problem for them. This is what the door has opened up to. And you've heard over and over again, when they sold us Common Core, they said these standards are better than what they have. That cannot be true. It cannot be true. You had 50 states with 50 individual sets of standards. The idea that Common Core was superior to all of them is absurd. If that's the case, if Common Core was superior to all individual 50-state standards, then our kids would really be tanking. But watch what happens here. How could they have known back in 2009, 10, and 11 that these standards were better when they'd never been tested before? When they'd never been used before? The moment they put them in, they told you how verifiably excellent they were. You know how you know it's not true? The guy who paid for it at first made it so. That's Bill Gates. And Bill Gates spent about $6 billion of his own dollars buying up textbooks and putting them in schools, buying laptops out of the goodness of his heart for schools, right? All loaded up with the new pedagogy. Bill Gates and his Bill and Melinda Gates and their Gates Foundation, $6 billion. Let me just ask you this theoretical question. What do you think your newspapers here in New London, what do you think the newspapers across Wisconsin and the country would have said if some right-wing billionaire spent $6 billion to orchestrate the schools the way he wanted them, to put all his stuff into them? Think they'd be okay with that? But it was Bill Gates, so you never hear a word about it. Bill Gates, he's a progressive educrat, so therefore it must be okay. But let me ask you, what are Bill Gates' educational credentials? What credential does he have? He dropped out of Harvard because school was worthless to what he wanted to do. That's exactly right. Do you understand the problem of this? And the people ask me all the time, well, what does Bill Gates get out of this? If you're going to impugn his character, then what's the... Well, wait a second. It's been conservatively estimated that 70% of American school districts across the country, 70%, need radical upgrades in technology, software, hardware, computer training to be able to run the kind of tests that the Common Core demands. Whose computers do you think are going in the schools? Whose technology, whose applications are being used? His is, right? No, I'm not suggesting to you that the only reason for this was for him to make money. It's control. What Bill Gates wants is control. He wants Common Core to be a worldwide phenomenon. Bill Gates wants every single kid in the world to be getting exactly the same lesson on exactly the same day in schools all across the world. One unified global education at a time. That's what he wants. And he's on record as saying it. But here's what he said in 2011 about Common Core when he was putting it in.
It would be great if our education stuff worked, but that we won't know for probably a decade.
Good. In 2011, when the whole thing was getting started, he said, we're not even going to know if it works until 2021, excuse me. We won't even know. The guy who spent a lot of money putting it in your schools, a guy who greased the skids, a guy who went into Catholic schools who couldn't afford to get rid of their textbooks, and bought them for the Catholic diocese schools so they could, and why the Catholic schools took them, I have no idea. They didn't have to, but they did. Well, I know why they did. The same reason half the Methodists, half the Lutheran schools in the country took Common Core, because they didn't want their kids to get an education that differed from the public school. We want our kids to have a public school education. And my question to you is, why then send them to Catholic school or a Lutheran school? You're sending your kids to Catholic and Lutheran schools, Methodist schools, Presbyterian schools, to get the exact same education that they get in the public school? When did that happen among our Christian churches? But that seems to 176 Roman Catholic diocese schools have Common Core. And I've talked to numerous bishops across the country about it, and that's the answer from the school administrators. Our kids have to have the same opportunities public school kids do. Okay? All right? So you're paying $10,000 a year to send your kid to a Catholic school to get a public school education that is highly sexualized, anti-truth, anti-American, outstanding. That's a great use of resources. We won't know, 2021, we won't even know, but we do know. We've measured Common Core each of the last 5 years. It's a disaster. At least if what you want your kids to graduate from school with is solid reading, math, science skills, if you want your kids to be able to enter college and to be able to compete at a high level, then we know it's a failure. If what you want is your kids to conform to a certain ideology, if what you want is your kids to be prepared in 6th and 8th and 9th grade to receive the message from progressive professors when they get to college, to be already part of, then you got that. That's happening. Here's Bill Gates in 2009, right when Arnie Duncan was starting the Common Core ball rolling. Did you know when the outgoing President Bush, Republican, and the incoming President Obama, Democrat, told you that if in 2008 and 9, if you didn't cough up countless billions of dollars for bailouts for banks and car companies, did you know that right away that money was going back to Arnie Duncan? And he's going to tell you this, Bill Gates, that millions of dollars already in 2009, March of 2009, 2 months into the Obama administration, $350 million of the stimulus package had gone right back to Arnie Duncan to create the test for Common Core. And that's another thing. He's going to tell you this. They made the test before they wrote the standards. Do you understand what happened? They made the federal tests before they wrote the standards. In other words, they had a foregone conclusion what they want, and they built the standards around them. Completely political. Listen to him tell you this.
We'll only know if this effort has succeeded when the curriculum and tests are aligned to these standards. Secretary Arnie Duncan recently announced that $350 million of the stimulus package will be used to create just these kinds of tests. Next generation assessments aligned to the Common Core. When the tests are aligned to the common standards, the curriculum will line up as well.
How many of you, right here in this little town, were told by your school administrators that they're just a set of standards, and our teachers are free to teach any way that you heard what he said, right? When the tests are finally aligned to the standards, the curriculum will have to line up as well. Why are your teachers spending so much time on social emotional learning? Because they can't spend it on the real aspects of teaching anymore. Because the curriculum is all already organized in such a way that it feeds the test. There's no deviance. I mentioned to you that when you taught your kids and grandkids, you knew when the book wasn't working, or you knew when the method wasn't working. You knew when to put the curriculum down and try a different way to reach your kids. That's what great teachers are. I've been a teacher for 25 years. The best teachers are the ones who can feel out. They know the kids, and they know if something's not working. And they can get off script and help kids be creative. There's no room for that in Common Core. In fact, if you're teaching kids methodologies or ways or attitudes or ideas that are contradictory or that violate Common Core standards, and the administration finds out about it, you're not going to be employed very long. This is part of the collectivity thing that's going on here. And you heard him admit, right, that already within a few months, hundreds of millions of dollars, we estimate about $7 billion of the stimulus funds that were supposed to go to bail out crumbling economy went right back to the Department of Education. They wrote the tests with it before there were any standards. You understand that whoever controls these tests controls the standards, right? Controls the classroom. That would be the feds. Arnie Duncan's a federal employee. This guy, David Coleman, he is the architect of the Common Core standards. He's one of 5 people who wrote them. You've been told the states wrote them. You've been told that teachers wrote them. You've been told even sometimes that governors wrote them. None of it's true. None of it. Now, I wish the governors had wrote. First of all, is there a governor in this country who is qualified to write national academic standards? As much as I like Scott Walker, he ain't qualified. There's not a single governor. But, so why do I wish the governors had written it? Because you can fire your governor. That's David Coleman. He has no educational experience whatsoever. He's never been an educator. He's never been a teacher. He's never taken a course in education. He's the chief man responsible for the standards. And do you know why Obama hired him? Because he was here's his claim to fame. He was Barack Obama's social media director in 2008. He's the guy who helped Obama use Twitter and Facebook and all that stuff to win the election. And for that, he was put in charge of your kids' standards. In fact, let him be introduced. Here's David Coleman being introduced to a group of teachers who he's now the boss of.
He has been involved in virtually every step of setting the national standards, and he doesn't have a single credential for it. He's never taught in an elementary school, I think. I actually don't know. He's never edited a scholarly journal, but I think he has written scholarly papers, and a variety of other things that everybody here has done some of. He hasn't done.
You'd think someone with Lauren's experience would understand you never tell the truth when you're introducing someone.
I actually think it's really important to try to base what I'm about to say to you on evidence I share with you rather than on the sands of my qualifications. So if I ask you or talk to you about doing something, it should be evident that it makes sense to you to do, because I have no other authority.
You know what blows me away about this? Here we are 6 years later, I'm still doing these talks, right? And the irony is that if you walk into one of these schools tomorrow here in your town, or you walk into a Milwaukee school, or you walk into a school in Kansas City or Michigan or Ohio, they're going to look you in the eye and tell you that Common Core standards are higher than what we have. They're going to tell you that the teachers wrote these standards. They're going to tell you, right? And yet, the irony is that this has been around for 10 years. The people who did this, they made no bones about it. This is a teacher conference where you heard what he said, right? And remember David Gruber's lack of transparency? You'd think Lauren would have learned by now, you never tell the truth about somebody when you're introducing it. And a room full of teachers, much more qualified than him, are laughing that he's going to now tell them what to do. It gets better. Listen to David Coleman on his own foundation. Just like Jonathan Gruber raked in about $6 million helping craft national health care, so too David Coleman has reaped millions. Here he is talking about his own organization.
So with that in mind, I'm about to jump in, but I'm just going to say one word about my own organization, which is Student Achievement Partners. Student Achievement Partners, all you need to know about us are a couple of things. One is we're composed of that collection of unqualified people who were involved in developing the common standards.
We are that collection of unqualified people who wrote your kids' standards. Now, the last time I came here, when we had a bunch of teachers and superintendents, and a couple superintendents and administrators in the office, shook their head no. I showed them lots of facts, I showed them lots of data about why the math wouldn't work vis-a-vis other math curriculums, and they just shook it off. I don't do that anymore, because obviously nobody cares about data. But what gets me is that whether you trust me or don't trust me, whether you like what I have to say or you don't, doesn't matter, because you're getting it right from the horse's mouth. We are that collection of unqualified people who wrote the national standards. And it gets better. As a 25-year teacher, to me, the most egregious, dangerous lie of Common Core is that our classrooms are still in control of our teachers, that our schools are still in control of our principals, that our districts are still in control of the state. In some technical and personnel ways, that's true, but not when it comes to education. The idea that your teachers are absolutely free to meet these standards any way they want, well, listen to what the unqualified fellow said about that.
Which is teachers will teach towards the test. There is no force strong enough on this earth to prevent that. There's no amount of hand-waving. There's no amount of saying they teach to the standards, not the test. We don't do that here, whatever.
You heard him, right? There is no force strong enough on this planet to prevent your teachers, yours, in this school district, from teaching to my standards. None. You can pretend all you want that they're teaching to the standards, not whatever you want to do. It's not true. And the guy who did it's telling you. This is John Gruber doing his victory lap, right? Tough. It's done, and there's nothing. And you know what should really make you mad? Not even the fact that he has no qualifications. It's the fact that you have no control over him. He is unelected. You've never heard of him. The taxpayers, the voters, the moms and dads who have their kids in these schools, you have no way to reach them. There's nothing you can do about it. Education was transformed by a rogue billionaire who happened to be a progressive and this guy who has he has no credentials. That's who did it. How do you stop him? What do you do about it? You could take that video into your superintendent's office tomorrow. Do it, Chris. I'd love this. I'll tell you, she'll look at you like you're crazy. She'll look at you like you're nuts. And the interesting thing about David Coleman, how about this? You know what he's doing now? No sooner did he oversee the writing of the Common Core standards than he left that position without any educational experience, and he is now the president of the college boards. You know, the organization that creates the exams that your kids have to take to get into college. He's in charge of them now. And he's rewriting the tests, the standardized tests, to conform to his Common Core standards, all without any experience or any qualifications. That, my friends, is what we call the death of the republic. That's what we call banana republic stuff. Unaccountable, unelected bureaucrats who you have no idea who they are, who have no profile, who have no experience, are transforming this country from issue to issue, and you don't know anything about it. That's a problem. Even if you think you like Common Core. God bless you if you do. How do you justify this? And so, not only is David Coleman in charge of the tests your kids have to take to get into college, see, which puts a lot of pressure, right? Why did those Catholic and Lutheran and Presbyterian schools all take Common Core? Because they knew the exams to get into college for these kids were going to be Common Core aligned coming down the road. And if we give kids a Catholic education, faithful to God and faithful to the family, well, they might not get into college. And that's the only reason we're educating your kids. Not for character, not for religion. We're educating your kids to be just like public school kids. The Catholic and the Presbyterian, the Lutheran schools, they realized if our schools aren't preparing your kids to succeed in a public school mentality, why would you spend the money to send them there? And so they conform. Not really an act of bravery to me. But another thing that David Coleman is in charge of, not just the tests your kids are going to take, he's in charge of the AP courses. Think about the advanced placement courses your kids take in high school. High school juniors and seniors love, I don't blame them, taking the AP course. You pay $100, $90. You can get a high school course for a year. You take a test at the end of it, and if you get a certain score, you opt out of that class in college. That college class would cost you $4,500 at Madison. You could pay $90 and get your entire American history requirement. And college can be wiped away with that one class. So David Coleman's in charge of the advanced placement history courses. So guess what he's doing? He's rewriting the advanced placement curriculum tests and making them very, very progressive and leftist so that high school teachers who have huge demand for this course have to change the way they teach history because kids have to be able to pass the tests. I'll give you an example. 2 years ago, there is rising alarm over radical changes that have been made to the Advanced Placement AP American History program, APUSH, Advanced Placement U.S. History. A program, by the way, the College Board, heavily supported by federal and state funding. You're paying David Coleman to do this with your tax dollars. That alarm flushes out another related travesty. The voice of the people has been muted because corporatists and other elites have figured out how to end-run the constitutional structure and are doing so on issue after issue. To summarize, the private college board is rewriting all of its AP courses, starting, not surprising, right? If what you want to do is indoctrinate, you start with history, right? Starting with AP U.S. history. The new APUSH framework departs radically from the traditional AP course and now reflects progressive philosophy and leftist bias. Forget the Founding Fathers and the principles of the Declaration of Independence that proclaim the natural rights of freedom and self-government, and focus in the AP course instead. Concentrate instead on the racist cultural imperialism that built America. Now you know why they're kneeling. Because we've taught a couple generations of kids this now. The history of your country is nothing but racist. And look, if the Confederate flag has to go because it flew over slave states, the American flag flew over those slave states before the Confederate flag ever did. It has to go. If you got to get rid of Robert E. Lee, you got to get rid of Lincoln and Jefferson too. That's what they're doing now. Every aspect of our culture is irredeemably racist, sexist, homophobic, and bigoted. It has to go. And of course, you and I know the history of America is much more complicated. Why is it? How come these kids never get asked this? That supposedly built America. Ignore all previous state history. Remember back when you were in control, Wisconsin? All previous state history standards, including those in California, were fact-based, balanced, and fair. Forget all of those now. This is the mindset. ignore all state history standards, all or most of which reflected a fact-based balanced view of American history. And when David Coleman received over 300 letters from mostly liberal progressive college history professors. He got over 300 letters from college professors of history, most of them progressives, begging him not to do this because it would give a skewed view of American history to our kids. The progressives said that. And you know what his response was, David Coleman? Facts don't matter when teaching history anyway. To objections that students will learn an inaccurate version of American history, the College Board responded that facts aren't all that important anyway. What is important are historical thinking skills such as contextualization and crafting historical arguments. Previously, the AP test would be a couple of some short answer essays and some fact-based questions. Now, it's all essay. Write an essay, 500-word essay, on America's racist past. Write a 500-word essay on sexism in the American government. So they're getting these leading questions now. And when the progressive historian said, you can't do that, you're not teaching kids history. You're not teaching him the government or civics or facts. You're teaching them to argue certain ways. Coleman's response, facts don't matter. Here, I'll give you an example. This is the preferred textbook. Most AP programs across the country use this. It's the Common Core approved one. It's called Out of Many. When I was giving a talk in Florida, a teacher came up to me. It was like a drug deal, man. She came up to me, she pulled me into the hallway under a big trench coat, didn't know what was coming. Whips out that textbook. It was the teacher edition that you can't buy. There's no way to access it. And she says, you've got half an hour to copy this. And so I made a couple copies, right? This is the entire paragraph on George Washington. One paragraph in the entire book about George Washington. The only mention of Jefferson is in relation to his slave ownership. Madison, Hamilton, not mentioned at all. Here's what it says about George Washington, the only thing the kids learn. Quote, although he dressed in plain American broadcloth at his inauguration and claimed to be content with a plain Republican title, Washington was counted among the nationalists. He was anything but a man of the people. By nature reserved and solemn, he chose to ride about town in a grand carriage drawn by 6 horses and escorted by uniformed liverymen. In the tradition of British royalty, Washington delivered his addresses personally to Congress and received from both houses an official reply. He was an elitist, a nationalist, implied racist. He was not a man of the people. He was just as bad as King George. That's what your kids learn. It's remarkable. This is the same George Washington. It's a great story. When Washington declined, they're implying that he wanted to be king. When Washington was actually offered a crown and turned it down, the story goes that in England, one of King George's ministers went to the king and said to him, sir, we have reports that Mr. Washington has turned down a crown. At which point, George III said, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in history. And he did it. But that you won't find that in the book. Oh, you find no crossing of the Delaware, no Thanksgiving Day parade, no Continental Army, none of it. That's what they learned. By the way, Barack Obama's inauguration, his inauguration in this book gets 15 pages. His inauguration. The Clinton presidency gets 64 pages. If we had more time, I'd show you the Reagan paragraph, 2 paragraphs on Ronald Reagan, all about Nancy Reagan and how she screwed up the White House. And so what happened? That's what this. And so if this is the textbook, and if these are the kind of questions we're asking your kids, guess what has to happen in almost every high school in this country that offers the AP? Teachers have to adjust the way they teach the course. Because if these kids are paying $100 and taking a year-long course and failing the exam, the whole system blows up. The teachers have to conform to this, right? Remember what David Coleman said, your teachers are going to teach to our tests. And he's right about that. And so that was 2 years ago. Last year, they went after the advanced placement European history class. And here is the new argument from last year. The new advanced placement European history framework has received a makeover from David Coleman that eliminates religion's influence on the development of Western civilization. The entire 1,000-year medieval period, the rise of the Catholic faith, all of that is completely ignored. There is no mention of it. The church is not mentioned. The Protestant Reformation is not mentioned. The entire European history for 2,000 years is absolutely devoid of God and church. Eliminates religion's influence on the development of Western civilization. It ignores completely Winston Churchill. It whitewashes the evils of communism and lauds the welfare state, according to Professor David Randall with the NAS, the National Association of Scholars. Quote, the new curriculum omits the development of faith and freedom in European history and focuses instead on the development of the welfare state, Randall told the College Fix. The association released a report on this that says that the new framework warps and guts the history of Europe to make it serve today's progressive agenda. Further, virtually all mention of religion in the 19th century is removed. Several key figures, such as Christopher Columbus and Winston Churchill, are not mentioned in the College Board's framework. David Coleman, president of the College Board, was a major architect of the Common Core standards developed under the Obama administration. The College Board's new AP European History exam, quote, defines modernization around secularism, the state, all with thin supportive intellectual history. It uses words like capitalism rather than free market to note how consumers and capitalists work against the environment. It gives the sense that the Industrial Revolution contributed more to poverty than to prosperity. It whitewashes the repressive Marxist and Soviet histories of Eastern Europe and predominantly features leftist Enlightenment political thinkers. That's the AP history. Oh, and he's going to go on every single AP course he's going to rewrite. I remember what Coleman said, we are that small collection of people, unqualified people. That's the guy who wrote the math standards. This is Jason Zimba right here. It's a little fuzzy. Jason Zimba. Jason Zimba is one of the 5 people working under David Coleman, paid by Bill Gates. Zimba wrote the math standard, almost exclusively. In this short video clip, Jason Zimba is going to admit that my math program that all your kids are taking, it will not prepare your kids for college level math. It will not prepare them for STEM careers. What good is a math program that will not prepare your kids for careers in science, technology, engineering, or math? It will not prepare them for that. At best, the really gifted kids might be ready for math at a 2-year technical college. He's being introduced in this video, you won't see her, by Dr. Sandra Stotsky. You may remember Dr. Stotsky was, as a retired professor of education, one of the foremost experts on childhood education. The Common Core hired her to vet their curriculum. They paid her to look at it and recommend it. She said, I won't recommend it, get rid of it. It's a disaster. They basically erased her comments and passed it anyway. So here she is, interviewing Jason Zimba about his math curriculum.
Agreement that I believe we have on this.
Thank you. Thank you.
The definition of college readiness, I think it's a fair critique that it's a minimal definition of college readiness.
I think your comment, Dr. Stotsky, is a fair critique. My math program is a minimum definition of college readiness.
The definition of college readiness, I think it's a fair critique that it's a minimal definition of college readiness.
For some colleges.
Well, for the colleges most kids go to, but not that most parents probably aspire, right?
It's not for STEM. It's not for international
That's true. It's not only not for STEM, it's also not for selective colleges.
My math program is not only not for STEM careers, it's also not for colleges with a standard. And he's going to give you a clever answer here. For instance, he's going to say, if your kid wants to go to UC Berkeley, he better have pre-algebra, right? Okay, fair. But you know what? Every college has a basic math standard. Any college that has a basic math entry level, and they all do, is the colleges he's talking about. Not only is it not for STEM, it is not for selective colleges, colleges that select based on math scores. It's not just UC Berkeley. It's UW-Madison. It's UW-Oshkosh that your kids won't be ready for.
It's not only not for STEM, it's also not for selective colleges that, for example, UC Berkeley, even whether you're going to be an engineer or not, you'd better have pre-calculus to get into UC Berkeley, right?
But we have to think of our engineering colleges
and that's
scientific
That's true.
education.
I think the third pathway goes a lot towards that. But your issue is really broader than that.
Oh, yes.
So I just wanted to make sure that we got that out.
I'm not just thinking of selective colleges. There's a much broader question here.
That's right. It's both, I think, in the sense of being clear about what this college readiness does and doesn't get you, and that's the big subject.
But not to call something college ready when it only applies to a certain kind of college and a certain lower level of mathematical expertise that won't buy you far on the international market in most major disciplines of technology, economics, business, and so on.
And all he can do is shake his head yes. I'll send you the video. If you think I edited this video to make him look bad, he looks worse when you watch the whole video. I mean, how can you sit there with a straight face and basically argue to the American people that our math program is not designed for math proficiency? Do you begin to understand why I showed you all that stuff going back to 1850? Because what you're watching here is the fruition of that. It is socially unjust that so few kids can do math. I couldn't. When I was in 3rd grade, I was doing 2nd grade math. I'm still doing 2nd grade math. I was smart. I married a smart woman. She's sitting right there. She can tell I can't do it. And so, but so what? So I was doing 3rd grade, 2nd grade math in 3rd grade. I was also reading at a high school level in 3rd grade. And see, I was behind in math, but I was allowed to read high school books. That's probably why I entered the high finance world of college professor, right? Because I was good at English. But they let me do high advanced English, and they weren't that bothered by me being a grade behind. Because you could have spent all sort of resources on me. You weren't going to make me that much better. It just doesn't come naturally to me. It's true for a lot of people. If you're a verbal person or a reading person, numbers confuse you and vice versa. I have many math students at university who don't write well. The two things don't always go hand in hand. But we have to have common education, common core. We have to have a common education. You were never going to, however much money you spent on me, you were never going to get me in calculus. But you know what? You could hold the kids who could take calculus back. Do you know that in over 100 school districts alone last year, they erased calculus from the high school books? Because it's not fair. We're not going to let the kids, what is it, 10% of kids maybe in a class can get there? Calculus is hard. If you're doing calculus in high school, you're accomplishing something, which is why it was always like 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 12 kids who did it. But that's not fair. It's not fair that those kids can do it, so let's hold it back. In other words, by holding back their high-achieving math kids, somehow I'm supposed to feel better about that. And then by holding me back in reading, that's going to make the kids who struggle with reading feel better, but that's the paradigm here. Give me another explanation why you would do that to your kids' math. There is no logical, rational, reasonable, mathematical explanation for it. None. This is pure sociology. This is the imposition of sociology, social justice philosophy into your kids' math classrooms. Do you feel better about it? If your kid stinks at math, would you feel better about the fact that the kids who can do math are getting punished on his account? But that's what they see as the answer to this. And by the way, you now know this, right? If you're focusing on outcome-based education, if you're not worried about what's going in, about who you're dealing with as individuals, all you care about is the outcome, welcome to the world of socialism. That's Marxism. That's what outcome-based education means. That we don't care what your kids' gifts or talents are. We don't care what they like or don't like. What we care about is when they're done with us, they will think and act and have the same basic competencies. That's success for them. And you know who agreed with me about these tests? You know who was saying exactly what I was saying? That guy before he became president. In 2007, right before he won office the next year, here he is talking to the NEA of all people about how stupid and worthless these big standardized tests are. Here's what candidate Obama had to say.
Don't tell us that the only way to teach a child is to spend too much of a year preparing him to fill out a few bubbles in a standardized test. We know that's not true.
I love the preacher voice. Don't tell us, right, that the proper way to educate a kid is to spend too much time during a school year only to fill out some stupid bubbles on a standardized test. We know that doesn't work. Look, you're going to give the same test to 60 million kids. You understand, right, that from a purely scientific psychometric perspective, that test can't tell your teacher anything. It can't tell a working teacher in a working class nothing. Data that broad can tell her nothing. Matter of fact, did you know teachers don't get to see your kids' tests? Tell me what the purpose of these tests are, when the teachers who have to then turn around and teach your kids can't see them. Did you know also that you're not allowed to see them? You walk into this school district come testing time and ask to see your kids' tests, they are legally not allowed to show them to you. So you got tests now that you just saw were paid for by your stimulus money in a lie, that were used to drive control, not education. All your kids have to take them. Tests that the teachers don't get to see, that teachers didn't write, how is this going to help anybody? Are you understanding me now? It has no, and he's right, it has no use. All these tests do is gather all sorts of data on your kids. Payoff vendors, crony capitalist companies like Pearson. It just gathers data, it records information. Matter of fact, they set these tests up to see how fast your kids fail. One of the things they do on these tests is they try to exhaust your kids. They try to put them through their paces. They ask them things that are intellectually above them to measure how fast they quit and what data they're able to gather on that. These tests have no educational value whatsoever, and your kid's entire education is dependent solely on them. So much so that your teachers, I can't tell you how many teachers I met across the country have said to me, Dr. Pesta, I close my door in math class for 10 minutes every day and I try to give them something else. But if my principal found out I did that, your teachers are running scared. Many of the best ones who were older quit and walked away. And what did he do? 1 year after he was elected president, he reduced American education to exactly the kind of exams he condemns here. And the NEA is cheering him for condemning standardized tests. And as soon as he made the entire system standardized test-based, they cheered him again. So this is the union that oversees your teachers. And how bad are these ridiculous standardized tests, when left-wing foreigners we bring over here to mock us? I could just, you got John Oliver from England, you've got this Australian guy, you've got Samantha Bee from Canada. Hollywood has this penchant for bringing over people from foreign countries to do late-night talk shows to tell us how much we totally suck. It seems to be an American thing. We like that. Progressives like to hear that. Here's John Oliver, the guy who replaced Jon Stewart. Here's John Oliver mocking shamelessly on his HBO progressive TV show, mocking standardized tests from the left.
If standardised tests are bad for teachers and bad for kids, who exactly are they good for? Well, it turns out they're operated by companies like all these, and let's just focus on the largest one, Pearson. As of 2012, they had nearly 40% of the testing market, almost triple their nearest competitor. And if you've never heard of them, then congratulations. But just mention their name to any parent or teacher in a state they operate in, and you see what happens. A hypothetical girl could take Pearson tests from kindergarten through at least 8th grade, tests, by the way, that she studied for using Pearson curriculum and textbooks taught to her by teachers who were certified by their own Pearson test. If at some point she was tested for a learning disability, like ADHD, that's also a Pearson test. And if she eventually got sick of Pearson and dropped out, well, she'd have to take the GED, which is now, guess what, also a Pearson test. Their track record is littered with complaints concerning technical glitches, slow grading, and even the contents of their tests. Take what happened in New York just a few years ago.
Almost 30 different test questions have now been declared invalid because they're confusing or have outright errors. They'd already pulled 6 questions from an English exam related to a bizarre passage about a talking pineapple. Students had to answer questions about the story, which they say goes like this. A pineapple challenges a hare to a race. Other animals figure the fruit has a trick up its sleeve, but the hare wins and the animals eat the pineapple. It ends with the moral: pineapples don't have sleeves.
I was really confused because I expected a lot more from them.
That article about the pineapple and the hare was stupid and absurd.
Did you hear what the announcer said? According to the students, the question goes like this, because we're not allowed to see the tests. The teachers don't know. The only evidence we have of that test question comes from the kids who took it. And remember when I said to you that the purpose of these exams is to frustrate your kids? Understand that little story in an English lesson. A pineapple challenges a hare to a race. The animals think the pineapple has something up its sleeve and bets on the pineapple. The hare wins the race, and the animals eat the pineapple. The moral of the story, pineapples don't have sleeves. In other words, it makes no sense. There is no moral, there is no rational progression of thought. You're asking kids nonsense questions just to see how they respond. Remember when I suggested to you they're trying to break your kids down? It doesn't make any sense. What good is a test that your kids can't see? And I'll give you one last thing. We've gone about our time limit, so I want to leave time for some questions. So we'll go to one more slide here. So if teachers didn't write your kids' exams, and teachers don't grade your kids' exams, teachers don't really get to see them, then who grades them? Would it surprise you to learn that Pearson is taking out $9 an hour ads on Craigslist for people to come in off the street and grade your kids' exams? How seriously do your exams matter to them if they're bringing non-educators off the street, paying them $9 an hour on Craigslist? Listen to this.
The company posted this ad to Craigslist. It's to find people to grade the exams.
We looked at an essay every 2 minutes, a short answer every 5 seconds, every 10 seconds. We don't understand your kids. We don't understand anyone's kids.
I was told when I was beginning a project that last year, there were a certain amount of 2s, a certain amount of 3s, a certain amount of 4s. We expect that to be similar this year. If that's not similar, they will tell you, we're scoring too many 3s, we're scoring too many 4s. And they'll say, you have to learn to see more papers as a 3. You have to learn to see more papers as a 4.
I'm a 20-year English professor. These people with no educational background, hired for $9 an hour, they were given 2 minutes to read your kids' essays, 5 seconds to read your kids' short answers. I can't read an essay in 2 minutes after 25 years and teaching at the university. I can't do it. You can't grade an essay. You can't grade a whole essay in 2 minutes. You cannot grade a paragraph-long short answer in 5 seconds. You can't do it. In other words, they weren't grading it. They were moving them through quickly. And then you heard the other guys, right? And we were told if we weren't grading it the way they wanted to, we had to regrade them. They went into those training sessions knowing what the output was going to be. And so they're hiring people with no educational background who could be bullied into grading it the way they wanted to. The whole thing is an utter and complete and total scam. This is, so my final comment before we take some questions to you is, the reality is here. The government schools are focused not primarily on giving your kids a good education. They are focused on socializing them the way they think is necessary, sexualizing them the way they think they should be, shaping their politics, their attitudes, and their worldview. That's what the schools are doing primarily. Social and emotional learning, psychological intrusiveness, right? Ran tests that are measuring everything but academic achievement. That's what's happening in the schools. There's nothing you can do about it. There's nothing I can do about it. There's nothing Governor Walker can do about it anymore. It's a federal issue now. My advice to you, and ignore it. I do not see a safe place for your kids in these schools. No, don't get me wrong. Is your kid going to come across a good teacher who's going to try to subvert the system? Yes. But your kids still got to take those tests. This is a broken system. And as we said to you 5 years ago, if we didn't fix it now, you wouldn't be able to fix it in-house. One thing you can do in a small school district like this is put some pressure on your school board. Dave Drake has got the names and the addresses of every school board member in this little town if you'd like to write them letters. I'd write them a letter if I were you. Because every time you get a decent man or woman on the school board, superintendents come in and crack down, right? Superintendents come in and bully people, right? The school district says we have to do. Why are you electing school board members if their attitude is, we must do what the superintendents tell us? You have a school board to stand up to the state administrators, to argue on behalf of your kids through your elected representatives against the school board, against the state people. Right now, the school boards are just rubber stamping this. I would write a letter. Start doing that if you can. But my final word to you is, if I were you, I would put, before you do any activism, make sure your kids and grandkids are getting a real education. You owe them that. We're in this mess, not because they did it to us, but because for about 100 years now, we as American citizens have decided that educating our kids belongs to anybody but us. That it's not our job, it's not our responsibility. We have decided, and whether you're coming at it from a biblical or a common sense mindset, education is the single most important thing we do with our kids. You do it every day in every way. When it comes to their school, their achievement, their future lives and careers, we farm it out to strangers. Sometimes they're nice strangers. Sometimes they're committed strangers. Sometimes they're strangers good enough to overcome this, but in most instances it's not true. Unless we as a country decide that we are the primary educators of our kids, whatever that means, homeschooling, finding the right kind of a private school. If you can't pull your kids out of public school for some reason, first of all, you can. But if you think you can't, you know what you can do? Do you do this? Do you spend an hour or two every night showing them how to do math in a non-common core way? When your kid comes home from public school, do you spend an hour with them in the evening? Tell me what you learned in history. Tell me, right? And then getting on your computer and showing them alternative perspective. Do you do that? Because everybody can do that. If you're not doing those things, we have no right to gripe about what they're doing. They now think that your kids belong to them. They just don't know better how to educate your kids. They know better what your kids should believe and think and feel. And that's what they're doing. They're prosecuting their roles as parents. And you know this is true. If any of you have tried to go to your school and talk to your administrators about this, they freeze you out. They don't tell you. They don't tell you what's going on in your kid's classroom. They don't share it. You're not a partner in the schools anymore. You're a problem, not a partner. So that's it, 6 years later. Thanks for listening, and we'll certainly take some questions if you have them. Make sure, please, that you stop by and get there's a sign-up sheet, and get the list of the school board members if you live in this town, get the list. And urge them, if nothing else, urge them to become advocates for parents and children, not for what state and federal government bureaucrats want. You can do that. You can certainly do that. And even if you're not from the school district, take one and write them anyway. Right? Let them know that's what we want.
Fill out the slides.
Oh, yes. I ended a little bit early in the sake of time, so if you want the slides, there, you can get them. Or sign that sheet and we'll mail them to you. You can have all this information for free. It's after 8. Does anybody, we don't have to, but does anybody have any questions, thoughts? Yes, Chris?
I'm sitting here and getting depressed about what's going on across the country and thinking all of a sudden I want to drop out of the school board because what good is it? You know?
Well, I'll tell you let me say what's good. I know you know this, but let me say what's good about it.
There's 2 of us here in the New London School Board. John is up.
Let's introduce them so people know who's working for. And you're Chris Markinson,
yes.
Right? And you're on the school board, and your name, sir? John Heidemann? Heidemann, and you're on the school board as well. 2 school board members felt passionate enough about this to come and listen at least. Give them a hand for doing that. Before I turn it back to you, let me just rhetorically answer your question. 95% of American moms and dads are asleep at the switch. They don't know any of this. They're not interested in any of this. The fact that their kids are out of the house 8 to 10 hours a day and they don't have to deal with them, that's the key. So you answered your own question. Why are you doing this? For those moms that are paying no attention, right? You may not be able to fix this. You're not going to fix this problem. But what you can do is you can do, as school board members, you can do your best to prioritize the interest of kids and their parents to, whenever possible and practicable, stand up to diktats from DPI people. Or this argument. I mean, look, you're school board members because you are the parents' representatives, right? They elected you. To turn around then and to say, we work for the superintendent, or gosh, the teachers union knows, they're teachers, they know more, I'm just a farmer, huh? Nonsense. You, school board members, are the last resort for moms and dads. You're the only resort they have. So there's a great reason to keep doing it, but my thoughts, yeah.
I just want to add one thing and let people know that we've discovered in the last little bit here that the New London School District has dropped the teaching, the rigorous teaching of cursive writing or long.
Yeah, that was going to be my next thing.
And that is, they haven't dropped it completely. They teach it for part of 2nd grade, but then beyond the beginning of 3rd grade, they don't. There's no district-wide effort to test it. It's not graded on or anything like that. And some of you know I have a monthly column in the Press Star. Thursday's issue, it's coming out on that, where I interview principals from our district and the 2 private school principals, which I salute because they are rigorously teaching it. Neither one of them are using Common Core in their education, and they are rigorously teaching cursive writing. I would like to hear from people, and you might want to let the other school board members what you feel about should we go back to teaching cursive writing.
And with everything we talked about today, that may sound like a small, trivial thing, but it's not. Every psychodevelopmental resource we have shows that teaching kids rigorously how to not just print or type, but to handwrite, it turns on parts of the brain that otherwise wouldn't be connected. Cursive writing is linked to radical advancements in learning and cohesiveness in the brain. This is just undeniably true. But even more than that, by not teaching our kids and making them accountable to handwrite, you are closing off to them all the ancient documents, including all of our founding documents that were handwritten. How many schools have you seen where kids can't read cursive anymore? So they can't read the Constitution. What do they get instead? They get textbooks that take the Second Amendment and edit out what they don't like and put it in typeface, right? I've got 4 different books in my office back in Appleton of textbooks currently in Wisconsin schools that have taken the amendments to the Constitution and taken them out of the handwriting, the cursive, put them in block type so kids can read them, but have changed the meaning of in so doing it. The Second Amendment, for instance, the one example that I've got, the Second Amendment is now about militias only. The only place to own guns, according to the new Second Amendment, the one that kids can read, the typeface one, they can't go back and read the original, makes it seem as if the only people allowed to have guns in the country are militia members. And that's going on again and again and again. So there are all sorts of valid developmental reasons why it should be part of the curriculum, and there are all sorts of historical reasons why it ought to be. It may seem like a trivial thing, given everything we talked about, but it's not. And even something, a small victory like that, the private schools here, the classical schools that are not Common Core driven are using it. That's why those kids are outperforming these kids. And this is the problem. And I'll say this too. If we're going to get 60 million American public school kids to this place, how you really think they're going to let private and homeschool go on? It may take 50 years. But if the prime objective of all of this, like I've tried to show you today, is not education, it's control and dependence. If that's what this is about, do you think when they finally consolidate their hold over the public schools, they will leave your Christian school alone? Do you think they'll leave your homeschooling alone? Already states across the union are like they're trying to do to us. They're trying to buy their way into private schools with money so that they then have a way to come back at those schools and say, if we're funding you, we have the right to ask that you do it this way, you take those tests, or you focus on this kind of curriculum. And so it's not even enough anymore to abandon the public schools and educate your kids. Sooner or later, your kids will, you wanted to start homeschooling your kids right now, you could do it. The question is, will your kids be able to homeschool their kids? And that's a iffy proposition. You know, and this sounds so dramatic, but it's a fact, it's a reality. There's only one law currently on the books in Germany, still on the books from the Nazi period. There's only one piece of legislation that they kept, and that is an absolute ban in Germany on any kind of homeschooling. The one thing you cannot do with fear of going to federal penitentiary in Japan or in Germany is to homeschool your kids. You cannot do it. Right? The model for this kind of control is to eliminate alternative educational forms. And right now, they're using social justice as the key. Right? How many of you saw that heartbreaking picture of the middle school football team, a bunch of 8-year-olds kneeling? Look, say what you want. I mean, maybe there's a reason, maybe there's a justifiable reason for it, but 8-year-olds taking a knee, right? Used to be, like I said, 30 years ago, your kids went to college to get politicized, but most kids didn't go to college. Only 38% of kids went, still 38% of kids go to college. 30 years ago, it was less. 30 years ago, about 22% of kids went to college, 25%. That's different. Now, right, as we keep pushing for higher numbers in college, we keep pushing this agenda, right? And you don't even have to go to college anymore to get it. You're starting to get this in high school and middle school and elementary school. So you're not going to college to get politicized. You're getting politicized at every stage now. Sexualized, politicized, manipulated, evaluated. And these psycho-emotional and social evaluations these unqualified teachers are doing to your kids, and I don't blame the teachers. They don't have a choice. They have to do this. But this becomes part of your kid's permanent record. This becomes part of their record. And Arnie Duncan said on the way out of office, he would like to see your kids' permanent psycho and social records, all this record keeping, they would like to make it available to employers. So some crisis, some politically incorrect thing your third grader does could be part of his dossier when at 22 he goes to get his first job. That's what they're doing here, right? And it is none of their business in any way, shape, or form. Yes?
Go ahead.
Repeat what was said about math not preparing the student to do what?
Quote from Jason Zimba. Not only does this curriculum not prepare your kids for STEM careers, it doesn't prepare them for selective colleges, i.e. colleges with really high math requirements.
If that's the case, what's the sense of teaching math?
The sense, that's the premise of my entire talk. The purpose of teaching math isn't primarily math. It's to use math as a tool of all sorts of cultural issues. Look at the way they're rewriting math problems. Look at new math textbooks. Every math question, every story problem is now a social justice construct. The way math math, the language of math is taught to kids. In fact, at UW-Oshkosh, there's a colleague of mine who wrote a book called Cultural Math. And the premise of it is how to use math to teach social studies, how to use math to teach a progressive worldview. That's the wave of the future. Now, don't get me wrong. Are your kids going to pick up some? If your kid's a talented math kid, will he pick up some math getting through this? Sure he will. If your daughter is really good at reading, will she be able to learn reading in spite? Yes. That's not the point. The point is that overall, the educational opportunities for all our kids will be significantly lower, and the politics and the ideology is going to be ratcheted way up. That's what's happening. And as a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, I can tell you, I'm seeing what these freshmen look like when they come to us now. 20 years ago, when I started teaching college, kids would come to me at the college level, and they would be pretty historically ignorant, but they were at least somewhat humble. These kids knew that they didn't know anything about history, and most of the kids felt bad about it. Now, they come to school ignorant and proud of their ignorance. They come to school not knowing anything about American history, and convinced that it's somehow morally superior to know nothing about our racist, sexist country. What's happening now after 20 years, the ignorance is the same, it's worse in some ways, but the political arrogance that these kids are bringing to campus is shocking. They know, right? They know. They know that sexism, bigotry, racist, homophobia, they know. And it's frustrating because you can cure ignorance, especially if kids are somewhat humble, but you can't cure this. When you try to teach them a different way, they're quick to stop you, right? None of my other teachers teach me this way. Where are you getting this from? Well, you're telling me that America's not what I think it is? It's a harder sell to do it that way.
Sounds pretty depressing, Arthur, but what's the percentage of students that you get that are that have come in with a pretty good mind over?
It's a good question. Right, I'm an English professor. I would say that 40%, 4 out of 10 of the students I teach every year shouldn't be in college. Either they cannot do the work, they're unprepared and they're incapable of the work, or their attitudes are so bad they won't do it. 4 out of 10. Now you understand, if I fail 40% of my kids every semester, I'm gone, right? That's 40 dorm rooms not sold, 40 meal plans not sold, 40 tuition payments not received, right? And so 40%, and of my junior and senior English majors, the average reading level of my graduating seniors is about 9th grade. The average reading level when I started teaching Shakespeare to my kids at the university, I would teach 10, 12 plays a semester. They can't get through 5 now. I do 5. Because I have to go so slow. I literally have to teach many of them how to read. Not just read Shakespeare. They can't read for understanding anything. So I teach half the plays now. We spend 3 weeks on a single play, and I go through the language, and they know nothing about the history, right? They come with no ability to connect dots historically. They don't know anything. They're historical. They're politically very outraged. They're mad as hell about Donald Trump, right? That makes them mad. But they can't really tell you why, and so they don't know the history. But when you put books in front of them, they can make no sense of them. And that's just, but it doesn't bother us. I mean, at the university level, to be completely blunt and honest with you, from a progressive perspective, I don't necessarily want smart kids, I want dependent kids. I don't really want critical thinkers. I don't want them challenging our ideology. I want them to vote the way we vote. I tell my kids this all the time. Our main objective at college is to get you to vote like us. Not to get you to think for yourself. It's to get you to vote the way we vote, all right? And it works. You look at the statistics of the way college kids vote after a 4-year university college. Look at how 4 years at a state university. Look at how for the first 3 election cycles, it's almost like 89%, I think is the number. For the first 3 election cycles, 89% of state college graduates vote the way their professors do. Now, interestingly, when they start having kids and mortgages and payrolls to meet, when they're in their 40s, some of them, not a lot, some of them will come back. But that's your 3 presidential elections in at that point, right? Abraham Lincoln was right. The philosophy of the classroom in 1 generation is the philosophy of government in the next. If you can get an entire generation of kids to believe this, then when they're in power, guess what happens? Everything changes. Last anecdote, and I promise I'll take one more question. An anecdote, one more question, and we'll get you out of here by 8:30. Anecdote. We'll take our last question. I think I lost lost my anecdote trying to explain what I was going to do. So you give me your question first. Maybe it'll come back to me.
Actually, I was just wondering if anybody else had seen this book. It was checked out of the Clintonville Library, all about our presidents and the Constitution. And to give you an idea what's in it, the authors of the U.S. Constitution only sketched a loose outline of the presidency when they defined the federal government.
And that book is textbook usable,
It's
right?
textbook usable. It also describes Barack Obama's presidency as the Tea Party interfered and got in the way of his agenda. And Donald Trump's opening paragraph in his biography is, he's the only president in U.S. history not to have done public service before taking office.
Yeah, that's what they're telling your kids.
And your kids can read this.
Quick announcement.
Yeah,
Does everybody know who Judge Roy Moore is?
Yeah.
Yes.
According to David, my friend here, 38% of the vote counted in Alabama. He is 15 points ahead.
Last question.
If you have a gifted child who, in order to reach his full potential, is going to benefit from graduate degrees, and you teach them with a classical curriculum, how are they going to pass the college entrance exam?
That's a great point. It's really primarily a scare tactic. First of all, about 112 colleges last year alone rejected the ACTs and the SATs altogether. Your universities may be radical progressive, but they're not stupid. I had a call from a friend who teaches at Florida State University at the beginning of the semester. He is a NASA scientist who has 2 PhDs in math. Florida State University assigned this guy to teach 2 classes of 7th grade math in the fall at Florida State. 7th grade math for incoming kids so they can begin to get some credit going. So, in other words, the universities already know that the ACTs and the SATs are pretty meaningful. I would predict in 20 years we won't be using them anymore. But what David Coleman's doing is scaring moms and dads into thinking they have to do Common Core. The other thing that is really important is nobody realizes this. Every single university in this country has their own entrance exams. Your kid wants to go to UW-Madison, your kid wants to go to UW-Oshkosh, call up UW-Oshkosh and say, hey, I homeschooled my kid or whatever, I'm not going to take this SAT. I'm going to bring my kid to your school on a Saturday afternoon and take your tests. They'll give them to you. And they're not Common Core. If your kids pass those exams, they're going to get into the school. People don't recognize that. And the final thing that you brought up that we didn't talk about that's outstanding, it's a good thing to remind me of. What about gifted kids? Do you see how dangerous psychologically this is? For a kid like me who is bad at math, I don't know what math I'm getting at a certain level. I'm not paying any, it's beyond me. What does this curriculum do to those kids? If you're a student who is innately gifted in math, you think that way. You're now being told that you're not allowed to think the way you were made to think. You're not allowed to understand it that way because it's unfair. Those kids who could do math, they're not just being held back. It's destructive, right? That thing which you know you can do, they're making these kids do math in non-mathematical ways. That's why we call this child abuse, right? You're making kids who can do math have to do it 1,000 ways that have nothing to do with numbers. It's all this writing now. It would be like teaching kids how to write by forcing them to use theorems or equations. Can you imagine in an English writing class forcing kids to use mathematical equations to express language? Now, the mathematical kids could do it. The mathematical kids might be able to pull that off. But what about the kids like me who were really, really good with language? You would worse than hold me back. You would crush any kind of educational aspirations that I have. And that's the real crime in all of this. But thank you very much. And if we've got some information, please at least take the name of the school board here in New London and send them a note. Just send them a note. Let them know what you think. Let them know. They won't. The people who oppose, the people who stand on the side of this kind of education, they're not going to take it too much to heart, but you can hold them accountable. And when you guys have school board elections, put more people on that are willing to listen. Too much of the school board is just, school boards all across the country are just yes men for the establishment. What are they doing there? Those are the little things that you can do in your communities to fight back a little bit. So,
tell us what you think of cursive writing so we know.
I think cursive writing is mandatory.
No,
yeah.
I mean, I'm telling the people.
Oh, I know. I'm sorry. You meant to tell them. Yeah, that's Chris is on that that big time. The really good private schools here are doing it, and the kids are succeeding. Get it back into the schools. They do in second grade. They tip their hat at it. They introduce it to kids. But as with any other skill, if you don't hold them accountable and extend it through their elementary period, extend their writing of it till they become comfortable with it, it's meaningless. They'll forget it like anything else they'll forget. You have to have that as part of the curriculum. It's not that complicated. And the argument is technology, Bill Gates, right? The kids of the future will they won't be writing anything. They're going to be inputting data. That's a pretty grim future if you stop and think about it.
Are you familiar with the Japanese form of education at all?
Yeah. The Japanese education system is an outlier. It's an odd duck. First of all, the Japanese are viciously selective of who gets higher education at all. So the Japanese are, in their typically methodical way, they're so over-testing kids at the youngest ages that a lot of kids are preempted from higher education, even high school education, so it's complicated. The Japanese is a very outlier system. The one that everybody points to is the Singapore system, which has its merits. And the Common Core math people for a long time argued that their math was going to be like Singapore math. It turned out to be nothing like it. But there's much we can learn, certainly from East Asia, in terms of how to teach math to kids. But you've all heard about tiger moms, right? Why do Asian kids generally, this is a huge stereotype, but why do Asian kids generally outperform American Western kids in math? Not because that they teach it better. It's because the moms and dads take no prisoners. There are no soccer leagues. There's no ballet lessons. There is no TV time. These kids are in front of the TV. They're in front of their books. They're doing their homework. They're in school longer than our kids. They go longer into the summer than our kids. And yeah, I'm sure those kids are missing out on certain social and athletic opportunities, but those kids really know their math. So you could do that with Common Core, I suppose. You could be more intensive about it, right? You could grind them down to nothing with it. Better yet, we've been teaching math to kids for 2,000 years, since the time of Euclid. What has really changed in math for kids in 2,000 years, 3,000 years? You're teaching math to kids from kindergarten through high school. Nothing's changed. All the new developments in math over the last 1,000 years come at the post-calculus level. Multiplication, addition, subtraction, geometry, trigonometry, nothing's changed. Nothing. We've taught kids in the West geometry and trigonometry for 2,000 years, and they've excelled. And now we're not teaching it to them anymore. Let that sink in. This idea that we need new math, this idea that every 4 or 5 years we have to come up with a new math curriculum, no, you don't. The numbers there's nothing new in math, nothing. The only new things in the math that your kids are getting is all the sociology. It's all the bells and whistles around it that have nothing to do with the math. And every 5 years we change the math curriculum and make it more progressive and more sociological and less genuinely mathematic. It is 8:30. I'm not keeping you another second.